Hey guys, good afternoon everyone. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Thank you for coming this afternoon, especially on a Friday. Today we're going to be talking about threat hunting, some of the obstacles we face, in corporate environments, and hopefully how to bypass them. My name is Matt Schneck. I'm a consultant at Security Risk Advisors. I generally speaking focus on the endpoint controls as well as doing data analysis.
My name is Kevin Foster. I talk very loudly apparently. I am also an endpoint specialist, primarily focused on incident response as well as forensics, and the purpose of this talk, forensics at scale, excuse me.
And my name is Ryan Andrus. I am generally an incident responder and do a lot of data analysis as well as focus on the endpoint as well. I also am heavily integrated with making sure the tools in the back end work as well for a lot of the threat hunting infrastructure that we work with.
In terms of a talk agenda, we're going to start off by defining what is threat hunting, our own version of threat hunting, the preparation and communication behind the steps, the framework that we typically use or employ during threat hunts, and then the post-hunt activities. In terms of how we define threat hunting, we typically define it in a number of different ways or a number of different objectives, but essentially we're looking to identify systems or accounts that are compromised in a corporate network, as well as look to build out or establish rules in areas of the environment that might have limited security controls or limited visibility in order to enhance or identify these types of things in the future. Additionally, some of the strategies we look to employ as part of these activities are anomaly-based or threat-based intel. Obviously, that's intel scans. Anomaly-based, so looking for unusual configurations or a thing that might allow an attacker access to a system, as well as behavioral. So essentially taking the MITRE framework, looking for tactics or specifically the techniques across a number of systems or in-scope systems. Additionally, the why do this? Essentially to identify systems that might have pre-existing conditions or alternatively been compromised, maybe before the security tools you put in place, so they don't necessarily have the visibility or have seen those attacks. As well as the blind spots, a lot of times in some environments you have legacy systems or parts of the network where there's no visibility into something occurring. So essentially trying to get visibility into those systems or those areas of the network. As well as looking for secondary compromises. A lot of times we see in organizations, they're very good at performing the initial analysis, say for example, phishing attack, but seeing a lateral movement or movement away from that primary box is sometimes challenging to see where additional systems or accounts might be compromised. Talking a little bit here about the high level, just to walk everyone through it. We typically see it in 3 core phases: the preparation, execution, and post activities. Each phase, generally speaking, has a number of different steps incorporated within each phase. Within preparation, obviously, we have identify the core team members, what team members we typically use as part of a threat hunt, as well as socializing with the key stakeholders. So looking not only at your security, your system admin stakeholders, but also who are the business stakeholders that we need to incorporate as part of the threat hunting activities and get their buy-in. Again, part of the preparation steps is identifying a hypothesis, and then as well as identifying the scope of systems where that data is going to be available to prove that hypothesis correct. And then as part of the execution phase, let's go out and from those in-scope systems, gather the data in order to prove or disprove the hypothesis. And then from there, once we've gathered that data, let's go ahead and perform some data analytics and some manual analysis in some cases with that data in order to prove that hypothesis true or false. And then once we've gathered that data, perform that analysis, looking at the post activities, what observations were made, let's document them, and then what rule sets improvement can we do in an environment. Those last 2 steps are critically important as part of the threat hunt because you need to get organization buy-in and not only to continue doing threat hunting, but additionally understanding maybe where you hunted, what activities were associated with that hunt in order to attribute the actions that you did. In terms of the threat hunt team selection, there's a couple different things out there on the internet we've seen, but generally speaking, we go with 3 core team members: a team lead, a developer, and an incident responder. Team leader, generally speaking, works not only with internal team and provides direction, but also externally and communicates with organizational stakeholders in order to get their buy-in. The developer looks to integrate the tools that you have at your disposal, as well as write any custom scripts necessary to perform data acquisition. Then the incident responder, essentially the incident responder's role is to look at what you're seeing within the data. Is it unusual in comparison to the configurations in the environment? Is what's running should be running? And then at the end, look to build out some anomaly detection. One of the other core things we look to do is utilize some internal security team member from the organization in order to leverage their environmental knowledge. That helps us get some more visibility or understanding as to what we're seeing and quickly be able to take some action associated with it. Activity tracking in an organization is huge as part of these threat hunting activities. And we, generally speaking, like to refer to this as a project because it's short in term and length, but repeatable. So one of the things we typically like to do is make sure that all the things we're looking to do are documented within an IR tool set in order to answer the question is, who did what on what systems? What accounts did we touch? What activities occurred and when did they occur? In order to be able to attribute all the things we did to ourselves, as well as answer a system admin when they say, you took down my system on this date and in this area of the network, and we can turn around and say, no, we didn't, which is huge. Additionally, in terms of tracking, this then starts to tell the story as to when you want to perform these in the future, what did you do, and be able to communicate with stakeholders and metrics, and be able to track and measure success for long-term improvement of threat hunting projects. What we look to do in terms of measuring success, there's 5 core things in measuring success when we look to communicate with stakeholders. So that's not only stakeholders at the business level, but that's also at a system admin level. 1, what's the hypothesis topic and what's the system scope, and is that data available? We need to make sure the hypothesis topic is selected appropriately, because if we select a topic and that data is not available, all of a sudden we're going to run into a number of different challenges. Additionally, we want to define a repeatable process within the threat hunting methodology to ensure not only is the process repeatable, but the results are consistent. Additionally, we want to reduce the attack surface. So one common example is if we're hunting through a network and find something unusual, let's be able to then move forward and take that and incorporate it into visibility in the future. So for example, if you have like an old version of CC Cleaner that's exploitable, let's get that out of the network. As well as develop environmental baselines. So it's important to understand what you're looking at so you don't repeat the same analysis in the future. And then the last one there is automation and rule generation. So taking the results or the visibility you created in the network and ensure that in the future you can generate an active or an automated rule around that. Getting approval, which is huge in an environment. So one of the key things to do in this case is speak the language of the individuals you're talking to and understand your audience. So in this case, we broke it down into 2 key groups, executives and sysadmins. And typically we like to break those conversations out into 2 different groups in order to target the conversation as well as the language we're looking to utilize. Essentially in execs, we're going to be able to do and perform something in your environment without capital cost, utilizing tools in your environment already. One of our favorites, PowerShell, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Additionally, be able to talk to sysadmins. So obviously they have uptime goals and be able to let them know we're not planning on breaking or modifying your system. We're going to leverage internal tools that either SCCM or alternatively configuration management uses in the back end. And as you note there at the bottom, we're not looking to deploy an agent. We're not looking for change management approvals because we're not changing anything. We're just leveraging existing protocols or control infrastructure. And then the last one there, we're not going to piss off sysadmins. One of the next phases, as well as communicating with stakeholders, is what are we looking to do? And essentially, when we're looking to select a hypothesis, we love the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's essentially wonderful in terms of mapping different techniques back to the tactics of what an attacker is looking to do or take malicious actions in an environment. So commonly, when we're working with a client, we'll look to walk through the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, select a technique, and look to socialize that, make sure the data is available. Then from there, look to try and gather that at scale. Talk about a hypothesis-driven methodology. So we like to take almost a scientific approach for proving or disproving the hypothesis. Essentially, the first step is identifying what you want to test, and again, we go back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework for that. The second step is identifying a plan to prove or disprove that hypothesis, and then from there, being able to execute that plan that you established on scoped systems in the environment and be able to acquire that data. And the last step there is doing that analysis, proving whether it's true or false, and then being able to document that accordingly.
All right, so Matt just talked through kind of our high-level focus here, how we communicate and get buy-in in organizations where there aren't necessarily clearly defined goals, or there's hesitancy in beginning to poke around on the network. A lot of times people express concerns. You want to touch every system on our network. Well, it's the blue team perspective. Your red team's penetration tests are already currently doing that, just kind of flipping the coin on them. So as far as actual data collection goes here, there's three primary groups that we look at. The first is endpoint, which is what we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of this talk, just because this is the one that a lot of organizations have room for improvement, or even collection in general, or starting collection in general. Not a lot of organizations are capturing endpoint logs very well currently, at least the ones we worked with. Network logs, hopefully everyone in here is logging one of these items, if not all of them. And same thing goes for account logs. There's a lot of really good data that can be mined here, and you can start looking at things from a very interesting perspective. So summary message is, even if you are not capturing everything on this slide, even if you only have one item, you can start looking at it from a blue team perspective and start trying to find bad or evil in it. As far as network hunting is concerned, a little bit of logs go a very, very long way. You can start running with some really interesting use cases, such as suspicious geolocations, port scanning, various data exfiltration methods. Our personal favorite is DNS logs, and Ryan's going to start talking about how you can start analyzing some of those. If you're not currently capturing DNS logs, we've had a lot of hesitancy enabling DNS debugging to, start capturing those in environments. I do want to give a shout out to Bro, which is in the very right-hand column here. It captures pretty much everything you could possibly want under network level. And depending on where it's positioned, you can start actually looking for system-to-system communications and doing lateral movement hunting. One of my favorite Bro cases to talk about is just capturing SSL and TLS certificate information. And in general, once you start grouping things together, most of your systems should be using the same communications. Things that are interesting to look at are self-signed certs, which Bro will just pluck out and explicitly tell you, this is a self-signed cert. When you look at a lot of the red team tools, Interpreter, Cobalt Strike, by default, they use self-signed certificates. So if you can whitelist those out, anytime you see a new one, it's probably something you want to go look at. So going back to Matt's idea here about baselining the environment, really the core concept is you want to figure out what is normal and then start defining alerts on things that are abnormal. When it comes to endpoint collection, in a lot of organizations, we end up having to use something called SIM sweep. If you've ever heard the name Matt Graber, which if you've attended a PowerShell talk in the last 5 years, I guarantee you have, he has actually been doing some work on the blue team side of things. He's often associated with red team tools. He wrote some great wrapper kind of functions for a new as of PowerShell version 3 Windows component called SIM, Common Information Model, which is the new and improved version of WMI. If you've been around a Windows environment for long enough, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's actually existed since Windows NT 4.0. So what SIM does is it pre-negotiates authentication for WMI communications, which really speeds up the rate at which you can talk to systems. Traditionally through WMI, there's a lot of back and forth, there's mutual authentication going on, it's very chatty and it's very slow. SIM sweep does all that up front, and that way you can just interact directly with each system. So really the benefit of SIM sweep is it speeds things up considerably. It is no longer as slow as WMI is, and it allows for scripted mass collection across an entire environment. As far as some of the drawbacks go, you are limited in what you can collect. Like I mentioned, it's WMI based. It needs to be in the WMI repository in order for you to collect that data. So you get some flexibility. You can start pulling back specific event logs if you're not centrally aggregating them. You can look for specific registry keys or file paths, as well as capture things like processes, services, scheduled tasks, all the things you normally look for when you're trying to figure out, is this system compromised? Unfortunately, you can only capture metadata, if you will, around those activities. So you can see that a process is running on a system, but if you want to go grab a hash of it, it's kind of a limitation of WMI. It's not in the WMI repository. There's no great way to do that through SimSweep or WMI. One of the things that trips up clients here is RPC ports. So there's really two methods that you can use SIM commands. The first is through Windows Remoting, which I'll touch on next slide. And kind of the legacy protocol is RPC. It uses some obscure ports. I think it's 45,000 and up. So if you have internal firewalls in place, that can potentially limit you from being able to use this tool and start collecting information through SimSweep. Fortunately, that's not very common. I guess unfortunately. I wish we saw more internal firewalls, but just speaking from our own experience, we don't really. It's never really been a holdup for us. But one of the main drawbacks of SimSweep is that it's a one-to-one data collection by default. When you grab this from GitHub, and there's a link on the bottom there, your collection system can only talk to one system at a time. There are ways around that. You can use PowerShell jobs, or if you want to get really tricky, there's some run space, multi-run space code available. BoProx has some interesting code around that. You can write wrappers for it and do one-to-many data collection, but if you just grab this from GitHub, you have to do one-to-one. As far as requirements to make this thing actually run, there's really only two. The first is the system you're collecting data with needs PowerShell version 3. Like I said, these commandlets weren't introduced until PowerShell version 3, but they are backwards compatible. So the data collection system needs PowerShell 3. All the other systems going back to NT4 do not. So there's really only one system here that needs to meet specific baseline requirements. And the second thing is obviously you need access to the system. You need local admin rights. If you don't have them, you can't authenticate and you're not going to be able to get anything back.
Just one comment, the PowerShell version 3, it's huge because most client environments we still work with still are porting over from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and as default, Windows 7 does have PowerShell 2.0, so you can run this in those environments that are not up to version 5 or later.
I mentioned you can pull back process metadata and services and things like that. And while you don't get all the juicy information like we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides in terms of hashes and specific things you can look for as IOCs, you can see in these screenshots there's still a lot of data. SVC host, if you ever see that running without that -k parameter, you have an issue. Very easy alert to create, and you can pull that information back with SimSweep. You can also check things for paths. If you see SVC host executing anywhere out of system 32, you have an issue. You don't need additional metadata to come to that conclusion. That is something that should always be true, and you need to go take a closer look at that system. So when you're talking about hypothesis generation, SimSweep really gives you visibility when you don't have any. Like I said, not many people are collecting endpoint logs, and we encourage all the clients to, but while you're trying to get to that point, SimSweep is a good alternative. The next step up from there is really PowerShell Remoting. You can see kind of a theme here. PS Remoting offers a lot of benefits. You can do one-to-many collection, which really speeds up the rate that you can collect data. The red team loves it for kind of the same reasons. Blue team does as well. One of the more interesting things here is it actually gives you direct access to the Windows 32 APIs, which you need to be a little bit more of a developer in order to make use of, but fortunately there's a ton of community support for this. One of my favorite recent kind of developments in this space is by Jared Atkinson, who released a get-injected thread script, which will actually walk through all the threads on a system, map them back to the DLLs that are loaded there, and try and find unmapped code, or also known as injected code. It's not something you can do with SimSweep, but it's something that we ran a couple weeks ago across 15,000 systems in less than an hour and a half. And quickly had a list of, I think, about 50-some systems that we needed to go take a second look at. So it's incredibly fast, and if you spend some time on GitHub, you can really find some interesting scripts that people have written. One of the problems here is it's not on by default. And this is where you need to start taking kind of a methodical approach in how you're communicating to stakeholders. When we first do a threat hunt in an environment, we get a lot of pushback about making modifications or changes to system. Oftentimes we'll use SimSweep as an initial starting point in order to say, we were able to meet these use cases and find these interesting things. If you're willing to work with us and, pilot Windows Remoting and enable this across the environment, this is the next list of things that we can do to support that. So really it's an iterative process and goes back to the communication that I was talking about. If you are not, effectively communicating upwards about the value add for what it is that you're proposing, you're not going to get anywhere, or it's going to take you a very long time. The screenshot here shows kind of a different take on the process level view. Like I said before, on SimSweep you don't get hashes. This you can clearly see. We're maybe not. At the top there's an MD5 hash. There's also a SHA-256 hash. When it comes to looking this stuff up, it's very simple to script this, run it, once a week, whatever it might be. Pull it back into a analytics engine like Ryan's going to talk about, and then do automated lookups on virus total. Once you get that process up and running, it maintains itself. Anything that fires is something someone should go look at. Really, the most sophisticated version of this is continuous logging. Windows event forwarding is something that seems like some people, it's on their radar, and a lot of others have never heard of it. If you don't have a central way to collect and aggregate endpoint logs, such as Splunk Forwarder or whatever it might be, Windows event forwarding is free. It's included in Windows, and they have a ton of great documentation around it. Jessica Payne, who is the author of that screenshot there, has done a lot of work on continuous monitoring and intrusion detection. Excuse me. And really, we try and recommend everyone to move in this direction. Hopefully through SimSweep and PowerShell Remoting, you've targeted specific use cases, right? You're not trying to capture everything here. The left-hand side of that screenshot, all the things, too much data, no context. You're better off picking and choosing. We just want to look at Windows run keys. We just want to look at Windows services. Don't log everything. Don't try and centralize it, at least not initially. If you do, it's too much data. You're not going to be able to give it the attention it needs, and you're probably going to start finding yourself walking down rabbit holes. There are thousands and thousands of logs to look through, even on a small network, when it comes to endpoint data. So the basic concept is be smart about what you're trying to log. Have clear goals and try and align your logging to them. As far as benefits here, what you've done is basically flip the script. Instead of having an acquisition system that's going out and contacting a bunch of remote systems to collect data, those systems are now themselves sending those logs up to a mothership. It's aggregating it for you, it's in one convenient location, and you can start throwing that into an analytics engine or doing whatever it is that you need to. Compliance requirements, security use cases, IT, what happened on the system before it went down. You're going to make a lot of people happy if you start doing this. Fortunately, one of the prereqs for this is actually Windows Remoting. So when it comes to threat hunting, when you enable the ability to interact with the system through PowerShell, you are also turning on the same service for Windows Event Forwarding. So by enabling one capability, you're setting yourself up to enable the next. So we really see this as kind of an iterative cycle. Start small, prove your wins, document everything, make it clear that you're providing value, and then move on to the next use case, because they all feed into each other. So in summation, if you're like a lot of clients we work with and you're not currently looking at endpoint logs, you should try SimSweep out. It's really simple to get running. The documentation on the GitHub site is very, very user-friendly, and it pretty much just works. You can modify that and add new functions if you want to, but Matt has done a fantastic job of pulling back some of the most useful information you want to look at. The next step from there is PowerShell Remoting, which is SimSweep on steroids, for kind of lack of a better term. It scales very quickly and it gives you a lot more flexibility. If you can write a PowerShell script for it, you can basically collect it, and there's a whole bunch of stuff available on GitHub, just to kind of reiterate that point. And another note there is, if you're sleeping on PowerShell still, it's kind of time to adapt. Microsoft is pushing it heavily when you look at some of the stuff they're doing in Azure as well as their server frameworks. They actually, I think they killed the project, but the Nano server, which was going to be a headless server, pure PowerShell, it's definitely the way of the future. And lastly here is Windows Event Forwarding. This is the goal that I think everyone should try and get to, and whether you're using Windows for it or another endpoint collection mechanism, maybe you have SIM agent or whatever it might be, you should definitely be making an effort to centralize all of your logs.
So moving into the data analysis and project tracking, I'm first going to talk about a few tool sets that we use actually within our infrastructure when we go to client sites to do threat hunting. So starting off with one of the first ones is MISP, or Malware Information Sharing Platform. What it essentially is a threat intel aggregator, whether it's a open source or paid private feed. MISP probably and will likely aggregate those feeds together for an IOC database that's hosted. Big things here. MISP is also integrated heavily with the Hive and Cortex, which I'm going to talk on in a little bit as well. And it allows app enrichment through threat intel. So VirusTotal, Shodan, domain tools. It has these tools built in the background so that once you have your IOCs in there, or even if you're doing an incident response, you find something and put it into MISP, you can then query the pre-built API keys that are in there to, add data enrichment to some of the IOCs or files in there. So what's the value and why do it? Bulk IOC queries. Long gone are the days now with MISP where, you have one individual who is hosting your IOCs on a text document or Excel sheet. I don't know how many client environments I walk into. I was like, hey, where's your repository of IOCs? And some guy gives me a text file. And it's one person, can only edit it one at a time, or if it's hosted in a network share, not everybody has access. With MISP, you also get the ability to do threat actor tracking. So whether you're assigning tags to different IOCs, different types of ransomware in an environment or in the wild that you kind of want to track, how is this payload developing over time? What is it doing to the Windows system over time? How is it trying to hide itself? You can track threat actors as it goes on. As well as MISP is SIM agnostic. Any data format that I've come across right now, MISP allows you to export. JSON, CSV, sticks, doesn't matter. And even if you haven't seen a data format that MISP supports, somebody's probably building it in Python right now, and it's probably out there. The last thing I want to touch on is organization segregation with MISP. When your company gets big enough, or if your organization is large enough, I've seen some people segregate like SOCs or NOCs. They can both contribute IOCs where both teams can see it. And if you don't want those databases kind of messed up by one person having full admin rights and changing everything you have, they can go through RBAC and approval processes or proposals of like, okay, we've cited it. Here's some changes that we've seen as it's developing. So big win for, hosting your IOCs. Now everybody can kind of concurrently look at them and also feed them out, via APIs through MISP database into your SIM or, other tools as well. Moving in, the data analytics or log aggregation platform that we like to use is Elk. So if you guys are not familiar, Elk is kind of everywhere right now. Elasticsearch is going to operate as your database, Logstash as your log shipper, data manipulation. We're going to get into that in a little bit. And then Kibana as the visual aspect of what you kind of do visually within Elasticsearch. The reasons that we love Elk, or at least I love Elk, I'm going to speak for myself, but is you get data manipulation via visualization. Whether this is trying to do it with, executives showing what you're doing reporting-wise, or even another analyst of, here's a quick data table, look at this. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, whether it's a bar chart, a heat map, data table, there's multiple different visualizations you can create. When it comes to those visualizations as well, it gives you advanced filtering, so whitelisting or blacklisting different file paths. If you want to data reduce, I don't want to see, say, program files right now. I only want to look in System32. That's it. You're allowed to do that. Getting a little ahead, but if you want to have the streaming data into Elk, you can use other tools like ElastAlert to kind of blacklist or whitelist file hashes. So obviously data reduction, but then blacklist and send an alert every time you see, SVC hosts outside of System32. Obviously, least frequency of occurrence is a data analysis technique that we are going to leverage. So process stacking, a lot of times we want to see these outliers. In a homogeneous environment, you're going to see, out of 10,000 systems, 10,000 systems are running the same applications and files. Let's, do least frequency of occurrence and let's see these outliers, or are these files approved with the environment, or is this actually evil? It gives you a quick win to drill in to see what's operating outside. The next one, rapid query results. Elk is one of the fastest data aggregators or log aggregators that I've actually worked with. And while this seems like a very simple thing, flexible query options like string queries, file path, app data, and temp. 90% of malware operates out of these directories, don't need privilege to run. But this same query in some other tools like ESM is like a paragraph long of regex. It's kind of painful. So, string queries along with a lot of other queries that you can do makes it rather simple to just hone in on different files or processes as well. Levenstein or fuzzy queries, so service host, malware hiding in plain sight. So if it's just SV host trying to hide within the same directory or even outside of that directory, you can kind of look specifically for, these common files as well. And this can be scripted as well on the Logstash side as well. And then going to Logstash, plugin filters. So Kevin touched on SimSweep, PowerShell, some other tools and different scripts that you can pull across different environments, or if you're building your own. But unifying your data fields when you're trying to build reports or hunt through the data is crucial. So, for example, with just even the different times that we have used SimSweep or even just PowerShell at different environments, image path, uppercase and lowercase, Elk sees them as differently, as well as just file path. building a parser to associate this is like executable path. Going forward, everything once it's logged in Elasticsearch is going to be executable path. So then we can correlate, stack the data as well. Further on this, parsing out like file extensions. Some of the scripts do that, some of them do not. So you can parse out the file extensions as well as, user fields. When it comes to stacking user fields, it's painful. So if you apply a parser to it, see users, and then you just replace that with a wildcard, and then you can also just filter it out as well. So now when I go to view this data, I can stack it and see the outliers as well. So data enrichment on ingestion. Logstash can make REST queries on ingestion, and Kevin mentioned this a little bit ago, but two tools, domain stats and frequency server, but mainly with domain stats, so definitely with DNS logs. Is it in Alexa's top 1 million? So two things that I know we've done. You can take the forensics approach and gather all data, just throw all your domains against it and just query it into Elasticsearch, because then you can start to build visualizations on geographical locations or just, types of names, different data visualizations, whatever you prefer. Or the other is, I only want to look at anything that's not in Alexa's top 1 million. So the only adjustment that you would make to this filter on the right there is add a tag and say, either is or, found or not found, and then drop if it is found, essentially. Frequency server. Test the Englishness of a domain. So essentially, was this domain generated or was this an individual creating it, essentially? Whether it's pseudo-random or an individual creating it as well. And then finally on the slide, virus total queries, or realistically any threat intel application that allows you to kind of do REST queries. In this example, we actually have a proxy server where when the data is ingested with the scripts that we pull, whether it's a raw CSV hash, or a raw CSV of just hashes, or the actual data coming in with the hosts associated with it, it's going to pull out the SHA-256 up there and run it against virus total, and then populate it within Elasticsearch with virus total and then, dot. All the information, and I'll show you a little example in a second. So this is really helpful. Both private API keys and public API keys work. Just with the public, you got to add a 15-second throttle to it so that you don't eat up that API key rather quickly, essentially. One other thing I will note, though, is what we use here and in this example is we have IP there. We have a proxy server where every time we run a hash, it saves the data and then shoots it into our Elasticsearch. This way that we only have to run one key once, and all the hashes are saved going forward. Kind of effective. We don't eat up our API costs per day. So don't expect you to read this at all. This is the JSON from raw input. This was a raw CSV of just hashes, and this is one hash, actually. So what it did is it pulled out the SHA-256 hash, and all of this is the virus total information. So the file names, the positives, was it clean, was it not clean? This is the raw JSON. In the table view, if you see in the top left corner, Elasticsearch and Kibana will make it a little bit easier to view. Or you can put it into a visualization. So for that SHA-256, what file names did virus total come back on? And then you can filter based on rating, because it's going to assign it, whether it's unknown, clean. I don't want to see those. There's no quick wins, at least right there. Let's see malicious and suspicious and drill into it further. And then from there, we can add another sub-bucket within the visualizations of what host was this associated with, or how many hosts have this actual SHA on it. So moving forward into the Hive and Cortex, the Hive is going to be our threat hunt process tracker. And Cortex is going to obviously help us with analytics as well. So starting with the Hive, it's a live stream of team member activity. It gives us accountability going forward, especially with they touched on as well with, being able to track, what were you touching in at this time and what users, what hosts, as well as project tasks assigned for visibility and accountability. Associated with these tasks, you can also assign metrics or statistics around it, so reporting for C-level executives or other data analysts who are being brought in from the client side. So I wanted to keep this picture up here because I referenced it already, but MISP, Cortex, and the Hive are heavily integrated. The developers going with these projects are actually going back and forth. I actually believe they had a conference last week or last weekend, releasing a new update actually with Hive this week. But one of the main reason or uses that we use the Hive is obviously for observation tracking. It allows you to populate all those hashes that I was just talking about running against virus total in here for, statistics based type or statistics based on type, IOC, or, tags. So if I want to say this is the East client, if we're doing, say, different domains, which we have done, like West domain, East domain, or the East client, West client, you can break them up by different tags so that when you go to do reporting, it's a little easier to kind of filter on these. The next topic, obviously, there is filtering observables. Out of the 276 that are within this, I'm filtering on only the ones that came back with an IOC hit that's of a hash type. It allows you to kind of search your data essentially with Elasticsearch or Kibana level, aggregate or filtering, if you will. So moving on to that, data analysis and automation. So this is where Cortex comes in. Looking at an observable, this is just one picked out. Essentially, when you do log observables, I'll take a step back for a second, but obviously adding your tags, was this cited? Different hunts, you can keep going forward. Was it cited again? And then description. Obviously, it's test just for this, scenario, but, what host, what user, what environment was this found on? Links, on the right there. When we do data acquisition, we did it once, and now we did it twice. If it shows up in another case, it's going to link right to that case of how it showed up. Analysis on the bottom is where Cortex comes in. Cortex has around 30 plus pre-built analyzers, and it's going to link your MISP instance, your threat intel, or whether it's paid or private, and any tools you have to make data analysis rather quick. So the main goal of Cortex is data reduction via threat intel correlation. Anytime that we can get a machine to do most of our work, I'm all fans for it for automation. But essentially, Cortex, as I was saying, has multiple analyzers. It breaks it up between the different data types. As well, on the right, you have the vendors or the different tools that it's going to be pulling from. The Hive helps here because it has pre-built templates. It makes, when you run the observables through the Hive, utilizing the Cortex analyzers, it's going to populate it into a nice, pretty template, almost like you're looking at VirusTotal itself. Makes it very easy to look at. On top of this, and I'm going to go back to here, is delegate and let the machines do your work. So when I was running those hashes, essentially at certain clients through, I just dumped in 10,000 hashes bulk import to the Hive, run the Cortex analyzer, do another 50,000 IPs or domains that I want to run it against our threat intel. So, it's doing all the work. I come back and I can filter on that data of what actually got hits, or, what is going to return so that we can dig into this deeper. So when it gets actually to data analysis and analytics, just talking about the tool sets right there, at least that we were using, data reduction is key. We've touched on it at least twice or three times now, but targeted threat hunt topics, persistence, and then registry keys. Just registry keys alone. And even then, run keys versus logon scripts versus services and tasks. When you run auto runs against one host or endpoint, you get thousands of results or logs that come back. You run this against 10,000, you're now looking at millions of logs. So when it's just auto runs, let's focus in on logon scripts, or let's focus on run keys. So setting the scope and realistic standards is going to help your threat hunt be a lot more effective going forward, as well as reporting it up to upper management. Least frequency of occurrence. So on the right here, obviously automated, semi-automated, and manual. This is kind of the forensics best practice when looking at an endpoint, because you're going to be looking at a wealth of data up front. We're kind of adopting this this methodology in the fact of looking at data. So stacking all the things, as I said, with Elasticsearch already. Homogeneous environment, every application or most applications or files are going to be consistent across, say, all 10,000 hosts. The outliers are going to be easy to pick out. Again, find evil or know what is normal in your environment. Whether this is Linux or Windows, this has to be essential. And this comes down to just knowing your environment and being in it long enough. Is service host running out of a path outside of System32? Is there single name characters .exe? Kind of suspicious. Or pseudo-random letters and numbers. Legit files operating in illegitimate file paths. So a lot of knowing what is normal and not normal is a lot of what data analysis techniques we're going to be utilizing. But in ELK, it obviously makes it a little bit quicker because you get to do some of these string queries like, hey, top 20 processes that are out of System32. Let's just quick look at them and see if they're outside of it. And obviously threat intel correlation. Talked about this obviously with Cortex, the Hive, and MISP. You quick wins, dump all your data in, see if anything comes back, and then move on from there. So a little example of data analysis and analytics within process stacking or process dump here. Obviously we just dumped in unfortunately, I'll say this is not a homogeneous environment. However, we did segregate it for least frequency of occurrence. So what process is found only across like one host or two hosts or, one count? And while this can be kind of hard to kind of look through, you kind of have to validate as well. There's two things that kind of pop out to me, at least in this example. It's coupons. Users love their coupons, or at least they don't realize they do, and these can be browser hijackers. I've seen them a lot, and we need to get these remediated off the host. Scrolling down a little bit more, not even half a scroll, and there's two more things. CC Cleaner 64, which Matt actually mentioned before, let's validate that this version is not the exploitable one. Going through and just making sure that, hey, I remember this from the news, or I remember this from our IC database, whether it's in MISP or the Hive. We got to validate whether this can be a vulnerability for us. And then mictray 64.exe or mictray, HP audio driver for some of you that are not aware of this, but essentially it writes every keystroke to the computer in clear text, making it classified as a keylogger. So real bad. We don't want that. We need to patch that and get that removed and make sure it's not doing that anymore. So now that we have observations, going back to the Hive, observation and result tracking. Like I said, with MISP, where it's a hosted instance, the Hive is as well. So we get to, host all of our observables so that all of our team members can view these concurrently. And we don't have to wait for one person hosting a master file with Excel. He didn't update it yet. He sent me the wrong version. No, it's all right there. People can see the live tracking updates as well. And on top of this, the Hive allows you to assign the tags, like I said before, for hash, IP, domain, etc. You get these pretty graphs, which can be helpful to digest the data as well as show these reports to going forward as well. So looking at accountability for team members and status updates for live streams, you can see on the right that's actually me dumping in around 10,000 hashes, and then probably the next step after that was running them through some threat intel correlation. But you see every time I interact with the Hive, whether it's adding an observable, adding a log to a different task that I was assigned, or anything, your team members are fully aware of what you're doing. A little bit to the bottom there, we see the tasks. So you can break up your projects and obviously have the metrics around these as well, so that each step of the process, if somebody's like, hey, what's the status update? Here, let me generate the reports of what metrics we have already. So drilling into like one task that's assigned, this is the first one, might be a little hard to see, sorry about that. But essentially you drill into a task and it provides a little bit more metadata. What's the description of this task? What's being asked? And on the right-hand side here, you get to add a log. So whether that's, every hour or at the end of the day for when we're on client site or at the end of the day in general, I'm updating my team of, hey, this is what I did, this is what's going on. And in this example, we're just distinguishing, these are the hunt topics we're going to be covering over the course of the week, so that everybody is up to date and they know what's going on with each task. So coming back, measurements of success, linking this all back around, hypothesis topic and system scoping. We have to pick threat hunt topics that are actually executable, like Matt was referencing. So is data based on data availability? Establish and define a repeatable threat hunt methodology. With some of the tool sets we were just identifying the Hive, you have tasks that make this repeatable. You can create these templates. Okay, new persistence topic, or another TTP that we want to identify, or TTT for a map back to the MITRE attack framework. We just pop out the template and do the same tasks over and over again. Identify and reduce environment attack surface. Any observables that are recorded, whether or not they are just, misconfigurations or actually malware, we're going to be reducing that, and it's trackable. So, hey, we found this time. Next time we come around, why wasn't this fixed? Develop environmental baselines. When it comes back to this, again, this is the process stacking in the homogeneous environment. From the example I showed, it can be a little hard to sift through data, but, approving what is approved business software, or, maybe implementing a system like COTS where, right off the shelf, it's only approved business software within the environment. And then the last, but not least, and one of the most important in threat hunt maturity, is automation and rule generation. So going forward, when we're talking about Windows events generation, or Windows event forwarding, and, just porting all this the information into a SIM or a data analytics platform, having it streaming, we got to create rules. So, hey, we looked at registry run keys already. And next time that a registry run key is created in like a certain file, I want to see that alert. I can validate it real quick. Just want to see what run key was created, so that going forward, it's not necessarily malicious or bad behavior. And that's all. Sorry, talk a little fast. I didn't know we had a little bit on time, but there's still a lot around this topic, so feel free to ask questions, come up to us. We love doing this stuff and love talking about it as well. So,
all right, let's give a BSides round of applause to Matt.
You got the mic? Yep.
Question?
I got stuff.
So when you come into a customer environment, are you writing this data to your ELK infrastructure as well as the customer SIM environment? And is that kind of intensive on read writes?
Yeah, so good question. When it comes down to a customer environment, obviously that's going to be distinguished before the engagement even starts. We're going to say, hey, we need to stand up or we want to stand up this architecture. Whether or not you guys can host it for us, that'd be great. If not, then we can do it on local systems as long as we get the approval. It's all about just communicating what is expected and what we're going to be doing and being very clear of how we're handling this data as well.
One of the key things I think around that too is time. What's the availability, time, and resources on their side? We're happy to bring our own systems in and just run it ourselves in order to do that and meet their goals or timelines. But if that's not something we can achieve in terms of working with them to stand up in the client infrastructure, we'll probably just support it ourselves.
So also when you walk into a customer for the first time, how long does it take you to figure out what normal is?
Great question. I think my personal opinion is it highly depends on the hypothesis topic you're looking to hunt for in the environment. Obviously, Ryan mentioned one thing around run once keys. If the scope of systems, say, is user workstations only, and it's a homogeneous environment, that's far quicker than, say, an environment where they've had multiple mergers and acquisitions, and a client wants to scope them all together. So I typically like to say, great, you have maybe 2 or 3 organizations as a part of your overall company. Let's scope them differently. Why? Because we're going to get much more continuous data or like data that we can stack as well as perform analysis on, rather than grouping all images together at once. You guys have any other opinions?
Matt touched on a little bit too, but also segregating that data based on, am I only looking at developer systems? Am I only looking at server systems? So when we start to segregate it that way, it can be rather quick learning what's normal and what is supposed to be the normal within a client. But it also heavily depends on, do they utilize a COTS? Do they utilize business approved software? Or does everybody kind of have free reign in local admin?
Just one more additional point there. I think the overarching opinion or overarching theme here is data reduction techniques. How can we get as much data out of what we're analyzing as much as possible in order to identify, say, something unusual?
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Again, another round of applause for our speakers. We've got a challenge.